It's Arthur Aidala.
Lawyers have been called a lot of things, but rarely are we called cool. That all changed on November 5th, 2022, when my guest became the first lawyer inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Let me just give you some names, drop some names that this Hall of Fame lawyer has represented. The Village People, Casey and the Sunshine Band, Kool and the Gang, Rod Stewart, Sean Combs, Luther Vandross, Andrew Lloyd Webber, Jennifer Lopez, Mariah Carey, Elton John, Madonna, U2, Sting, John Mellencamp, and Bruce Springsteen. Then throw in some of the world's biggest music companies like iHeartMedia, MTV, Live Nation. What these artists and companies have in common is a decades-long appreciation of the brilliant, creative mind and deal-making skills of the empathetic and honorable gentleman sitting directly across from me today. In a business of vipers and pickpockets, this man is known as a mensch. Please welcome Alan Grubman.
Thank
Hello,
you very
Alan.
much. I'm very happy to be here today.
Now, let me leave anybody out of all your big names?
There probably are some, but that's enough. I am very happy with your list.
Okay, so I want to ask you some serious questions, and then we're going to have a little bit of fun.
Okay, shoot.
Why does the music industry attract so many sketchy characters?
It generates problems and controversies because people claim that they wrote part of songs and that sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But at the end result, most of it gets resolved. And when you're dealing with creativity, everybody has their own view of what's creative and what's not. And sometimes somebody will say, well, I wrote those notes on such and such a time. Is that part of the song that I'm hearing now? So there's always, there's no objective way of looking at a song and saying that nobody ever did this or everybody ever did this. So you always have people who are complaining that songs were partially written by them or they just make it up. It's a way of getting publicity for certain people. So the bottom line is litigation it's common, but it very often leads to 99% of the time a resolution. And most of the time these claims are baseless, and the few that do have validity are usually resolved. But you know, everybody wants to take credit for everything. That's
so
why
historically, artists even like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, even Elvis were in like these lopsided deals that would generally favor the record companies and management.
and publishers.
And publishers. So
Right.
tell us a little bit, Alan Grubman, how did that come to be?
Well, in the 50s, you know, the music industry was a very different industry. It was owned very often by private individuals. Now these companies are multinational public companies, Sony, UMG, even Warner's. But in those days, it was a very small business, and very often artists were taken advantage of. You would have some unknown artist who has the opportunity to make a record or to get signed by a publisher. They very rarely had lawyers. They very rarely had sophisticated lawyers. Whatever was put in front of them, they signed because they wanted to be a recording artist or they wanted to be a songwriter. So they really were not focusing on what they were giving away. And that was the case for many, many years. But as the business grew, became more sophisticated, and lawyers such as myself started to practice, I would say in the 70s, then everything started to have a different perspective. Artists needed to be protected because they were being taken advantage of. And when sophisticated lawyers would approach these companies, they realized that their old game was coming to an end, that they couldn't just take absurd advantage of these young artists. And what ended up happening, the deals started to become more balanced. And at a certain point, the artist was more important in the negotiation than the company, because a unique artist is one of a kind. There were always a lot of record companies, always a lot of publishing company.
In 2022, just now, when you were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, this is what Bruce Springsteen had to say about you.
Alan was instrumental in rebalancing the scales in favor of the artist. While they call it the music business, the business always held the upper hand. Allen turned that around.
Bruce is giving you credit with turning it around in favor of the artist. So tell the people a little bit, how does Alan Grubman, a guy from Brooklyn, how do you turn it around?
Well, first of all, you know, when we got into the 70s and I started practicing law, I would develop relationships with the record companies and the publishing companies.
And who were the record companies at the time in the 70s?
It was CBS, Warner's, Polygram, and the major publishing companies. And I would sit down and explain to them that times have changed and you have to catch up to the times. And it's not a good image for you to take advantage of an artist or a songwriter. It's not in your best interest because it became a very public industry. And as time progressed through the 70s, they realized that the deals that they made in the 60s and 50s weren't going to cut it. And I was very, very proactive. It's a fancy word, yelling and screaming at all these people and saying, if you don't change, you're going to die. I don't mean physically, I mean professionally, the companies. And as time went on, by the time we got into the 70s and 80s, just as Bruce said, we turned the tables. Because somebody like a Bruce Springsteen to a CBS Records was more important than CBS Records was to Bruce Springsteen. We had the upper hand because when Bruce Springsteen put out a record, it generated enormous amounts of money for these companies, much more than in the 50s and 60s. So the leverage changed. All of a sudden, the artists had greater leverage than the companies, and I took advantage of that. I made sure that with that leverage, they ended up being treated properly and getting the right deals and getting what they would do, which wasn't the case in the 50s and 60s.
Okay, so I need to go back to the genesis of all this. Give me, first of all, the genesis of you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you come from? Give me a little bit about that.
I grew up in Brooklyn. At the age...
What neighborhood?
Crown Heights.
Okay.
Lefferts Avenue between Schenectady and Troy, for people who know that area.
God bless.
When I was 11 years old, and this is a story that many, many people know who know me, my mother was a stage mother and pushed me into getting an audition at a television show in New York called the Horn and Harder Children's Hour. Horn and Harder was an automat cafeteria. They sponsored this show with young children, you know, performers, and it was on every Sunday morning. So I was on that show for 2 years. My mother pushed me, got an audition, I got on the show. At the age of 13, my voice changed. So all of a sudden, my career in front of the camera was kaput, over. And that was that. And then I ended up going to college, City College.
Very good.
23rd in Lexington. And then after that, I didn't know whether I wanted to get a degree in marketing, an MBA, or going to law school. So I ended up applying to law schools, and I was fortunate enough in those days, because I wasn't a great student, to get into Brooklyn Law School. So I'm in Brooklyn Law School, and I remembered when I was on television that everybody like lived well. They would take us to the best restaurants when we were on a break. They would take me home in a limo to and from. So I said, that burned an image in my head that I never forgot. So I said, okay, now I'm in law school. Maybe I want to be an entertainment lawyer, because I remember all that I experienced when I was 10 years before. So I graduate law school.
How'd you do in law school?
Not well.
I mean,
But I don't want to say it too loud. Not
there's a
well.
rumor out there that your class rank was number 2. Is that an exaggeration? Or?
From what, the bottom?
Oh, is that what it is? Oh,
Not from the top.
Okay.
So I graduated law school, and I taught for a year. There was a terrible need for teachers, and there was a thing called the Vietnam War going on. So if you taught, you got a deferment because there was a desperate need for teachers in those days. So I taught for a year until I was 26. And then I finally got a job. I wanted to be a movie and television lawyer, but I was able to get a job with a gentleman by the name of Walter Hofer, who was a music lawyer. He had represented the Beatles in the early 60s, etc. And he gave me my first job. And from there, I stayed with him for 4 or 5 years. Then I went on my own and blah, blah, blah.
Who would you consider was your first big client? First one that really like put you on the map?
Let me think. I would have to say it was two. It was Hall & Oates and the Police.
Really?
In the 70s was the disco era. And in the 70s, I ended up representing so many of these disco acts, several of which you mentioned. But the first, bona fide superstars that was the Police, which was Sting and Hall & Oates. And then in 1980, after representing all of these disco acts, and they were great. They're still around today.
How was it representing the Village People?
It was it was so much fun.
They were fun guys?
Oh, it was hysterical. It happened by accident. There were two Frenchmen that created the Village People. One was the songwriter and one was the businessman. And what they did, they came to America and they didn't know how to put together a group. So what they did is they held open auditions. And they were starting to hold all these auditions, and one guy after another, and eventually he picked 4 guys, Jacques Morali. At my apartment, there was a piano, baby grand piano. They had no money, so he would come to my apartment and he would write songs. So these 4 guys said, when are we going to make a record? When? He would come to my apartment during the day and write. He was very talented. And he wrote 2 songs, Macho Man and In the Navy.
Great.
And he wrote these songs, and then what happened was he said, okay, let's give it a shot. They went into the studio and did these 2 demos, almost as an accident. In other words, they said, what the hell? And somebody listened to it and said, this stuff is great. And we ended up making a record deal with Casablanca Records. And they exploded. Now, they all lived in the Village. In the Village in those days, when you went out to bars on Friday night, Saturday night, you got all dressed up. So all these guys dressed up. One was dressed as a policeman, one was just a fireman, one was a cowboy. And that was how the Village, they all hung out in the Village. So that's how they created the Village People. They named it the Village People, and they dressed in those outfits.
Do you remember how the song YMCA came into life?
Well, it was In the Navy and Macho Man, and then the second round, YMCA and San Francisco. They wrote about 6 or 7 till this day. They didn't write it. It's Jacques Morali, of the 2 Frenchmen. One was creative. He wrote all those songs.
Now, did they make the kind of money that these artists in 2022 make?
They are making, the Village People today are making more money than they've ever made in their lives.
Why is that?
Because in those days, the record royalties were very small, and so they didn't, and there were 4 of them. So they didn't make that much money individually, and they made some money touring. So the money was totally different than it is today. Today, if an artist does Madison Square Garden, they could take out $1 million. If there's somebody like Billy Joel, you could take out $3 million.
What do you mean when you say take out? I mean
that was what they would earn for the night. In those days, the numbers were minuscule. But what ended up happening in the early 2000s, there was a resurgence of disco music. You remember Donna Summer and all of these other acts, and they started working. And now when they were working, they were making 10 times more than they were making in the 70s. So the 70s created these acts, but they're really cashing in on it the last 15 years.
Well, let me ask you about the progression, because Alan Grubman, you've lived through it all. Literally, when you started, there were two formats of music, right? There were albums and there was 8-track. And then
There were albums and there were singles.
Singles,
There
right?
There were LPs,
45s, right.
LPs and 45s.
Right. And there was 8-track for a little while.
Then there was 8-tracks, and then after
Cassettes.
cassettes,
CDs. And now
streaming.
Right.
And everything before streaming basically is irrelevant.
So tell me how that affected the finances. How did that affect your job?
CDs changed the game because everybody's collection of LPs, they had to go out and buy CDs because those were outdated. So in the 80s, there was a tremendous resurgence, and that's when record companies started making a fortune because everybody had to take their entire collection and buy CDs.
Now, do the artists make money on that? When
Yes, because every time
So a Village People album that now someone buys the Village People CD.
they got a new royalty
Okay.
because it was a different product, and in the 80s, the music business surged because of CDs, and then all of a sudden, artists started selling instead of 500,000 as you got into the late 80s and 90s, they were selling 5 million, 10 million. Saturday Night Fever, which was, I think, in 79 or 80, that was when it really started. That record sold 20 million, that soundtrack, but it was one of a kind. But then when you got into the 80s, and you had the Eagles, and you had all these other, the sales started generating in the millions instead of in the hundreds of thousands. In the old days, a gold record was 500,000. Then the platinum record was 1 million, and then it just
Double
went,
platinum.
Yeah, it went through the roof, and they.
So Alan, let me ask you a question. You know all of these people, and we rattled off some of the names. Do you have any personal relationships with them? I'm a lawyer. There are most of my clients I do not have a personal relationship with, and then there are a couple who we've just really hit it off, and we've maintained a friendship through the years. Is there anyone that falls into that category?
I wouldn't start saying who are my friends or not friends because I'd be upsetting people, or
right.
maybe not. But I will tell you this: that John Mellencamp called me up when he heard that I was being inducted. And he said, "Alan, I've known you since the early 80s. I'm not asking, I am telling you I am inducting you." Oh. And I said, fine, of course. But, I have professional relationships with all of our clients, and I have personal relationships with several of them.
Well, let's hear what our friend Bono has to say.
Bono, Edge, Adam, Larry. You're not listening to me. You're not listening to me. Aren't musicians supposed to have ears?
That's my style. My style is I am very verbal and very loud. And when somebody isn't listening, I make sure they listen.
Well,
Yes.
And you have a good relationship with Bono,
Oh,
obviously.
yeah. I've represented Bono probably 20 years, Elton John 25 years, Bruce 35 years, Mariah Carey since she's... Yes, these are all very long, well-established relationships, and we have enormous respect for each other.
What keeps a band like you two together for all these years, and other bands that you've represented who split up after tremendous success, but a much shorter period of time?
History. Let's take U2, for example. Those guys have been together since they're 17 years old. So it's truly, everybody throws out the word, we're family, we're family. They are truly family. They're now 60. So that means they know each other over 40 years. They stick together. When bands break up, very often it's for emotional reasons as well as practical reasons. For some reason, they stop having that magic together. They start irritating each other, or one party or one member thinks that he's creatively more important than the other. It's relationships. It's like marriage. It's like anything else. Very often marriages don't last, and there are those occasions where marriages last 60 years.
Would you say ego plays a huge role in some of these
Ego
situations?
plays a huge role in life. The guy who delivers groceries has an ego. The name of the game is to try to manage your ego, and some people can and some people can't. But you know, when you stand, you know, I've asked this of a few of my clients, how do you deal with getting up and performing in front of 70,000 people? How do you do that? I mean, I would look out and I would say, holy shit, this is crazy. They have the ego and the ability to stand and perform and feel comfortable. That's ego and whatever else it is. You have to have an ego to be a performer. Whether you're a rock star, whether you're an actor, even if you're behind the camera, if you're a great director, great record, you have to have an ego. You have to believe in yourself and believe that what I'm doing is special.
So let's talk about what you do as a lawyer. Let's listen to another clip from another one of your very, very famous clients.
At the time I met him, I'd never met a lawyer before, so I had nothing to compare him with apart from the character of Robert Duvall in The Godfather. So I had no idea what other lawyers were like, and I still don't.
So that's Sting telling you that, you know, basically he's indicating you're the only lawyer he's ever had. He never knew what a lawyer was, and he still doesn't, except for you. Tell me a little bit about how you met Sting, how you came to represent him, and what your interactions have been like with him.
He was managed by, this is in the 70s, by a gentleman by the name of Miles Copeland. The group Police had 3 members: Sting,
Andy Summers,
and Stuart Copeland. Miles Copeland. Miles was Stuart's brother.
Okay.
So I started representing Miles, and he had represented, I remember, Wishbone Ash. He had a few acts in those days. And then all of a sudden, his brother becomes a member of this group, the Police, these 3 guys. That's how I met the Police. And out of the blue, they recorded a record called Roxanne. And Roxanne was the first hit that the Police had, and it exploded. And they became huge. And I represented them for several years, and then eventually Sting, the group broke up, and Sting went out on his own, who has had a brilliant solo career. And then I've continued to represent Sting.
So tell the folks, what do you actually do? Alan Grubman, you're the lawyer for the Police. What do you do? Are you helping them lease their apartments? Are you getting that? What do you do as a lawyer? Not this week. What do you do as a lawyer?
Well, as a lawyer in the media business, you're a businessman as well as a lawyer. So when our artists have to make deals with their record companies, with their promoters, when they go out on tour, when they do their endorsements, when they decide that they want to have clothing lines, every transaction that they are involved in, the firm negotiates, represents, and makes sure that everything is done properly. So we're business advisors as well as lawyers. We have 2 functions.
So when you would sit down on behalf of the Police or on behalf of Sting, you're the one who's sitting on the other side of the table from a record company?
And I will negotiate the deal with the record company. They very often have managers who are very effective, but I usually do the negotiating. And then, you know, the manager is involved, et cetera, et cetera. And then after the negotiation is over, there's an enormous amount of legal work that's involved in these. So the law firm is 50 lawyers. So we do all the legal work.
So there's obviously a lot of lawyers that watch this show because of that. That's our profession. In a very general sense, how do you charge people like this? Is it an hourly basis? Is it a percentage? Is it you guys just sit down over a cup of coffee and figure it out, or a little of everything?
It depends. If it's a corporation, usually we do monthly retainers, and when we do special deals for them, we charge fees on top of that. When they are artists, there are 2 ways. The general day-to-day stuff we do for them, we work out some monthly retainer or whatever. But I call it instinctive billing. when we go out, or when I go out and make a huge deal for a client, I figure out what I think is fair, and then I'll sit down with them or the manager and tell them what I think is fair, and there's usually a 5-minute negotiation. Nobody said, oh, that's great, just for the sake of it, and it takes 5 minutes, and we work out the fee. So that's instinctive billing, which is where we generate big fees. But all the other stuff we do is either on a monthly retainer, and we have certain corporate clients that insist being billed hourly, which doesn't really choke me up, but I deal with it.
Alan, I think what makes you so unique is I've never heard the term instinctive billing before. I don't believe it's something they teach in law school. However, I think it is fantastic, and I think it's very real.
It is.
And I think it's something that happens in my line of work as well. I now have a new term that my lawyers here are going to hear on a regular basis. So give me an idea of what the part of your job that you don't really like that much, but it's a necessary evil that you have to do.
I am a lawyer. I hate doing day-to-day legal work. In other words, I don't remember the last time I ever read a contract, and God knows when I drafted a contract. I don't enjoy that. My ability, I believe, is to communicate with people and be able to convince them that what I think my client should have or get, I convince them of getting as close to that as possible. That's my talent. My talent isn't sitting at a desk and reading a contract or writing a contract.
Have you ever been in a courtroom?
Yes, when I was inducted into the bar. When I was admitted, I should say. That was the last time.
What year was that?
68.
Okay.
68, I think.
Of all of the clients you've dealt with, who do you think would have made a great lawyer in front of a jury, in front of a courtroom?
Bono. Very bright, very well spoken, very well respected and admired. He would have been a great lawyer, but he wouldn't have made as much money as he makes.
Yeah, well, that I understand. Can you think of an example of people, artists who have had poor representation and it's really hurt them?
It wouldn't be appropriate. I know several artists.
So it does happen.
Oh, yes, yeah, absolutely. And poor representation could be a fatal illness, because every artist usually has a certain amount of time that they are at the top of their game. And if they miss that opportunity,
how do you account for someone like the Rolling Stones?
I've known Mick, to say hello. I've never represented him. He knows who I am, and I know who he is. And those guys they're the ultimate outlier. I sometimes wonder. The Beatles were active, I think, from 62 to 69. I wonder what would have happened if the Beatles stayed together. What would have happened? Nobody knows. I was at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this weekend. I took my grandkids, and there's every rock star in the world, and then there's Paul McCartney, who's at level 12. He is the ultimate rock star, the Beatles. And everybody acknowledges, whether it's Bruce, whether it's Mick Jagger, whether it's U2, whoever it is,
Paul
McCartney is
This
Paul
is what
McCartney.
I heard Mick Jagger say. He said, I will give the Beatles as being a great studio band, but they never did a tour. They never did a real arena tour, real stadium tour. And he said the Rolling Stones are the best live band. And I think that's a fair compromise.
Okay.
Considering they've been around for 60 years.
The question is that I always get, will the Beatles' music and will Frank Sinatra's music still be played 100 years from now?
And what's Alan Grubman's answer?
I would say, because I've thought about this, I would say that for different reasons, both of them. Now remember, the Beatles are the Beatles because of the music they wrote. Sinatra is Sinatra because of the music he sang. But, Sinatra started in the 30s, it's 90 years, and he's still Frank Sinatra. So I think he's going to be around forever. And the Beatles are incomparable. I don't represent them, so I'm not saying it from my perspective. There was only one Beatles. Rolling Stones were a great live band. U2 is a great live band. Elton John, great live band. You understand what I'm saying?
So does someone like Frank Sinatra go into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Okay.
His music was the American songbook. We all know what that is, you know, the music of the, you know, of the 50s and 60s or whatever. No, he's
But
not.
they do have like rap artists in the Rock and Roll Hall of
Rock
Fame.
and roll now is considered from the 50s, which was R&B and Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley, through the 60s, the English Revolution, you know, the Beatles, Mick Jagger, blah, blah, blah. That's when the American bands came in, the 70s, 80s, and now in the 2000s or 90s, you have hip hop. That's absolutely part of rock and roll.
You know, you just mentioned Elvis, and I saw Bruce Springsteen's show on Broadway several times, and he gives Elvis basically all the credit for creating rock and roll. What are your thoughts about Elvis Presley?
Elvis Presley was the first bona fide rock star, without a doubt. His roots were from black music, which is R&B, which is the basis of rock and roll through all these years. So yes, Elvis Presley was the beginning of modern rock and roll. There were a couple of rock and roll songs before. Remember Rock Around the Clock, Bill Haley and the Comets, but when Elvis Presley arrived, he took the flag and put it in the ground. And that, yes.
Did you ever meet Elvis Presley?
No, I did not.
Did you ever meet Frank Sinatra?
Yes.
And what was your encounter with Frank Sinatra like?
This is sort of a famous story. I am representing Princess Stephanie of Monaco. Her mother was Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly was very close to Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra became Stephanie's godfather, in a sense. So in the middle to late 80s, she had a hit record, a disco record. And I was asked to represent her. And I told her on more than one occasion how much I loved Frank Sinatra. She called me one day and said, Alan, Uncle Frank is performing at Carnegie Hall and I got your tickets. I said, oh, great, blah, blah, blah. And then she said, and I've spoken to him about you and he'd love to meet you. Wow, that was big. Went to the concert. After the concert, they took me upstairs. People were milling around his dressing room. I opened the door, I walk inside, and there's Sinatra wearing a bathrobe, towel around his neck, slippers, vintage Sinatra. And we start talking. He says, you know, I hear good things about you from Stephanie. You know, she's my goddaughter. And I assume you're taking good care of her. And I'm saying, yes, blah, 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 blah. Going backstage is always uncomfortable because you can't think of things to say other than, oh, your show was great. So after about 2-3 minutes, I see it's winding down. And I said, can I call you Frank? He said, yeah. I said, you know, in those days, I mentioned Madonna, Bruce Springsteen. I rattled off 4 superstars. And I looked at him and said, you know something, Frank? I'd give them all up in a minute to represent you. And he looks at me and says, you know something, kid? You're stupid.
Wow. Wow.
So he understood the strength of these acts. And you know what? I would have.
Yeah, well, I mean,
because you know, till this day, you know, we've spoken
guy.
about this. Seriously, Sinatra, you know, I mean, I just think that Sinatra, I've convinced one of my grandchildren who's 14 to get into Sinatra, and he's starting to enjoy
Oh,
it.
good for you. My mother has done an adequate job of doing that with my nephew, Nicholas. Of all these acts that you represent, do you listen to any of them?
Yes, you know, I have some favorites. I love the American Songbook. Everybody knows that my idol is Frank Sinatra. You know, that's pretty well known. But yes, you know, I represent the greatest rock stars of the 20th and 21st century. Yes, I go to their concerts when they're in New York, so I'm familiar with them. Some I like better than others. I'm not going to start telling you.
I know. I would never.
But you know, but yes, I am familiar.
Let's
with
talk.
them.
You said you brought up the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, so you just get inducted. Tell me a little bit about that. First of all, I know you're a founder, but you obviously had nothing to do with your nomination, correct?
Correct.
Right.
You can't buy it.
Right.
No.
So tell us how that happened. And
Well, for years, there was just talent, etc. Then, 2-3 years ago, they started inducting managers, like Irving Azoff and John Landau, who are managers. John Landau manages Bruce.
Huge.
Irving Azoff manages the Eagles. Now he manages Harry Styles, etc. So they obviously got together. There's a committee of 7 people, and they got together and they said, you know something, maybe it's time for Allen to be inducted. You know, he's done this, that, and the other thing. And I was told 2 months before the announcement.
and who tells you? How do you find out?
I found it out by the chairman of that committee. And
They pick up the phone and give you a call?
yeah, gave me a call and said blah, blah, blah. And obviously I was excited. Debbie was ecstatic.
Beautiful bride.
And yeah, and you know something, and then, you know, I didn't realize the magnitude of it until that evening. It was in LA at one of the convention centers, and it was their annual induction ceremony, and I was the lawyer, which had never happened before, and nobody was expecting much. And then it went on, and finally it got to me, and they have this video of these 4 huge artists who were talking about me. Some of those clips,
Right, Bruce.
Bruce, Bono, Mariah, and Sting. So all of a sudden, you know, say, wow, this is interesting, because it's also an audience. It's not just people in the industry. So then after that, John Mellencamp gets up and he speaks about his dear friend and lawyer, and then he starts bringing up anti-Semitism. And people were like, because he's not the guy you would expect. You'd expect Bono to talk about it, Bruce to talk about it, and he starts talking about it. He was saying that anti-Semitism is disgusting, and artists have to stand up against anti-Semitism. They have to. Silence isn't enough. They've got to verbalize, talk about how bad it is. And he goes this brilliant speech, and then afterwards, I get up, and everybody who's inducted spends time thanking this one, thanking that one, or talking about their accomplishments. So I started by saying, what am I going to sit here and talk about the legal work I do or the advice I give to people? That's bullshit. Let me tell you an interesting story. And I proceeded to tell them how the Hall of Fame was created. It started in a Chinese restaurant with 4 of us having Chinese food, and Ahmed Erdogan, who was our leader, was talking about creating the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And that's how the thing started, at a restaurant called Pearl's Restaurant. I brought obviously my 2 daughters, my grandchildren, Debbie's children, grandchildren, her brother, blah, blah, blah.
Was that the most significant part for you, having those grandkids there?
Yes, because, you know, children and grandchildren very often don't understand who their parents or grandparents are for some reason. So they really, my grandkids got it. You know, I'm standing up there, blah, blah, blah. Everybody,
thousands of people.
Yeah, and everybody loves rock and roll, including them. Jesus. And that was important to me. And then on Saturday, I took them to the museum, and we walked in, and they see this exhibit about their grandfather standing next to Sting and Elvis Presley and all the greats, Jerry Lee, and that was a reaffirmation that, yes, that was very important to me.
Is there anyone that you feel comfortable about saying over the years in your interactions in the music business was just a jerk?
No.
Okay. Jan Wenner said, you know, you made no contribution of any kind by any definition to the creative development or the history of rock and roll. That tick you off a little bit?
That was very disturbing. He got an enormous amount of heat from the Hall of Fame, the foundation and the board, because it was like totally unnecessary, and he was wrong, and I think he sort of acknowledged it. But yes, I mean, he said it at the time.
Wasn't very nice.
It was upsetting to me, but you know.
And it's not true. I mean, okay, depending how you dissect it, but what we spoke about earlier, you and I, is if these artists sign the wrong deals, it's fatal.
And you know something? There's the music business. There's the music, which is the creation, and the business, which is the business side of the music business. And if artists are not properly represented on the business side, their music, no matter how good it is, never gets its due. And Jan really never understood that.
So let's talk about the music business now in the world of streaming. Tell the people who are listening, how has the world of streaming changed your job as a lawyer representing these artists?
Well, because of streaming, it's, you know, full albums are not necessarily the thing. It's the individual tracks, and it's marketed completely differently. You know, now you have you can, like Taylor Swift, she releases 3 tracks at a time, and then eventually, it's no longer the old way. You can now hear anything you want ever through streaming, whether it's Spotify, who we represent, or it's Apple. It's a different business. So the live performance business, now you could still, for certain artists that streaming is very important to, younger artists, there's still a lot of money to be made.
How do they make the money in the streaming?
Every time there's a stream, an artist and a record company gets a fraction of that, because the streams now can run into hundreds of millions.
Okay.
So it isn't like, you know, a big record was 5 million records. Now you could have but it's streaming of one track, but you put it all together, and now the live business has become extraordinarily lucrative for those acts that have a big audience, and a lot of them are the legacy acts. See, the legacy acts do much better.
Give me a definition of a legacy act.
All the acts I just represented, those classic acts.
Okay.
The Rolling Stones,
okay.
the Eagles,
right? The Who.
The Who.
Right.
They can still fill stadiums and arenas. They make tons of money.
And that's just from the gate? They're making
From
that money from?
basically from the gate, and then they'll make money from merchandising attached to the gate. You know, merchandising is T-shirts. Very often they're sold at the performance, and as well as in retail sport. Merchandising is a lucrative area for artists.
And you do those contracts as well?
Yes.
Okay. So let's just talk a little bit about how you divide your time and you divide your energies. You know, you talk a little bit about, you know, you represent Spotify. Well, before we get there, let's just hear what one of your marquee names, female, has to say about you.
We're not talking about like the cowardly lion here. Like, it's Alan Grubman.
So that's Mariah Carey.
What I said before, I am very vocal and very persistent.
Yeah.
That's the whole ball game.
You ready for a hard question? You're in your office, your beautiful, well-appointed office on 57th Street. Your spectacular assistant, Mary, rings your intercom. She says, Alan, there's 3 people here to see you. Madonna, Mariah, and J-Lo. Who do you want me to send in first?
I can't answer it. It's too difficult. 2 of the 3 I represent, and 1 I used to represent. Don't put me in that position. I don't want to.
Look at you
get
taking
calls.
the 5th. Is that what you're taking the 5th?
Taking the 5th. Mariah, I've represented since she's 18.
So talk about it, because she's had a very up and down run, but she's still on the ups.
She's still one of the great artists.
And does she have a good contract?
Yes, she's well represented. She will tell you she's a diva, and I've represented her since, let's say, 18, and she's now, I think, I'm no.
Yeah, well, it's no secret how old
she's
she
older.
is. Right.
Madonna, I've represented since 81. So I've had a lifelong relationship with these.
Now, since we're both lawyers, you know, a lot of times people come into our office and, like, they're not really looking to hang out with us, some clients. And then there's other clients, they definitely want your attention. So is this part of your instinctive billing process to know this client wants me to hold their hand and be there for them a lot, and this client wants to get in, do the terms, and get out? How do you figure that out? Is that your Brooklyn street smarts?
No, but it depends on how they react. I know how much they want to know about the details of what we're doing. Some of them, years ago, I had a client who's still an important client, who used to say to me, Alan, if you tell me that I am being treated properly, that's all I have to know. Then several years later, he calls me up and he says, you know what, Alan? Remember what I told you a few years ago? Forget that. My wife has discovered jewelry. Now I want you to get the last dollar I can get from everybody.
There you go.
And I laughed my behind off. And that's what I didn't change my MO, but all of a sudden, from not being that interested in the terms, as long as I told him was fair, now he was aggressively, I want to get the best deal. Blah,
So
blah,
that's
blah.
a great question. You know, I've been around the media for quite some time, and I can tell you I have noticed the change in people from when they're making $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 a year to $7, $8, $9, $10, $11 million a year. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that often in your career when you start off with people that are making nothing and you've created tremendous wealth, multi-generational wealth? Have you noticed a little change in their demeanor,
The
their
really
personality?
smart ones have lifelong careers. And very often the ones that aren't smart, they go from $1 million to 15 million, and then they start doing stupid things and they burn and crash and burn.
What about their actual personalities? Do you see
everyone-
their egos getting out of control? Or
The ones I just described, the second half, they get so enthralled with themselves, they start making mistakes, they start pissing off people, they start treating people differently.
And what do you attribute that to? DNA? Bad, poor role models around
I always
them?
say dumb is a fatal illness. Dumb. They don't get it. And they're dumb, and what happens is they fuck up, screw up.
So
And the smart ones don't. They survive.
there's two more things I want to tackle with you regarding the industry itself. Number one, these artists, and I know you're involved with several of them now, who are selling their entire catalog.
Yes.
Like Bruce. You did Bruce's deal, correct?
Yeah.
You did Sting's deal, correct?
Right.
Anyone else I should know about that who's the catalog deal
Paul
you did?
Simon,
Paul Simon, right.
the estate of Bowie.
Wow. So you never stop amazing me there, sir. Like, what's that business plan all about? Selling their
That
catalog?
business plan is
That's a relatively new
following.
thing, or no?
Yes, relatively new because the prices have gone through the roof. When an artist gets older, they start thinking about estate planning. And when you start thinking about estate planning, this was some of their perspectives. Is it easier to manage money or easier to manage copyrights after I'm gone? Who's going to manage them? Who's going to be able to manage them properly? Could they possibly, these people that are going to be managing it, could they be taken advantage of, etc.? So several of them have chosen, I will sell my asset, which will generate a lot of money, hundreds of millions in certain instances. I'll pay my taxes, and then I'm going to have a very large sum of money that can be managed by professionals, money management, and they'll be managed conservatively, et cetera, and it's easier to figure out how you're going to establish trust for the kids. Because once the money is there, you can decide who's going to get what.
What does that mean now? That means now when Born to Run is played on the radio, Bruce Springsteen doesn't get a nickel anymore.
I don't want to mention names.
Well, it's all over the newspapers.
But basically, when you sell, generally you're selling the entire asset. There are some exceptions where some artists keep the writer's royalties, etc.
Yeah, someone sold 50% of their,
or some
their
of them
catalog.
sell 50% only.
Neil Young, I think that was.
Yeah, and he held the other 50%. So there's different ways of doing it. But it's the principal reason is to take the speculation out of the value of the copyrights after they're gone, knowing that they're selling them today for prescribed value, and usually the income will generate more money than the income from the copyrights.
So, okay, that's a very important point you just made. So I understand from the artist's point of view why they would want to sell it. Now, someone who's buying these things for 200 million, 300 million, 500 million, Alan Grubman, how long is it going to take for these people to get that money back?
First of all, it's like buying a great painting. When you buy great art, you know what eventually happens? It's worth more and more and more, whether it's a painting, whether...
You hope.
Pardon me?
You hope. It's speculation, right?
But usually when you buy great real estate, you know that when you buy world-class real estate, it's going to go up. It might be like this, but at the end of the day... So the bottom line is that these artists, their body of work are like great paintings. And they'll always be worth more than, I believe, than what these companies are paying for them. I believe.
Well,
that.
It's interesting though, because we just had this conversation. Will they be playing, Frank Sinatra music and the Beatles music 100 years from now? Will they be playing Paul Simon music 100 years from now?
Guess what?
Right, it's speculative. We're speculating.
But think of some of that music. Bridge Over Troubled Waters, from The Graduate. It's highly, listen, already, again, the American Songbook, which was Rodgers and Hammerstein and all, they've been gone for 100 years. Still people listen to that music on a regular basis.
Yeah, the shows are
and
on Broadway.
That's 100 years.
You've represented some companies as well, right? Like you mentioned Spotify. Weren't you involved with Live Nation for a while?
Yeah, I still do. Live Nation is the company that does all the promotions. Whenever an artist goes out on tour, there's a high likelihood it's being done by Live Nation.
Is there ever a time where there's a conflict between you representing Live Nation and you representing the artist?
I never represent both at the same time. And let's say if I'm negotiating Live Nation now with U2, U2 knows that I also do work for Live Nation. They have to agree. And they always do, because you get more with honey than you get with a gun. Because of my relationships, they usually do very well because of...
So what you just said is a very important role. When you're negotiating throughout, and has it evolved through the course of your career? Has that always been your mantra? You catch more bees with honey than vinegar?
Yeah. I've never had a litigator in my office. I think that's a waste of time. Everything can be resolved. There are rare exceptions, but generally everything can be. This is a business that moves very fast. You can't take an artist and tie him up in litigation for 3 years, because by the time the litigation is over, people have forgotten who he is.
They're like boxers. They got a short
George Michael was an example of that.
Tell me about George Michael.
George Michael got into a huge fight with Sony Records. He was signed to Sony. It took 3 years or whatever to resolve. And then by the time it was done, all the heat was over. Then he made records, but it wasn't the same because the momentum was gone.
So the lesson from Alan Grubman is, obviously when you negotiate and you settle, there's times where you may be leaving money on the table.
Everybody walks away happy and everybody walks away a little unhappy. Then you know you've hit the right balance.
For the young lawyers out there who are listening, and they meet their first potential Bruce Springsteen person, who's got somewhat of a name for themselves, how would you tell a young lawyer to present themselves to lure that client into that office?
This is what I used to do. I made it clear that I wasn't a fan, that I didn't want to hang out at the studio, that I wasn't looking to go to their every concert, that, as I said, this music business, I was there to take care of their business. And I said to them, I can take care of your business much better than anybody else. But if you expect me to come to the studio and hang out with you or whatever, I'm not for you.
Okay.
Simple as that.
So you're not there to be their buddy. You're not there to be their
fan
shadow
or
person.
Suck up to their sycophant. I'm there to take care of their business.
When a rock star in general wants to go into a fancy apartment building or a co-op, is that a hard thing?
Not only hard for them, hard for me.
Tell me why.
Well, it's changed. Now it's condominiums. In the old days when it was co-ops, you had to pass a co-op board. Now a condominium, you don't have to pass a board. But in those days when it was co-ops, you would go before the co-op board if you wanted to buy them, and I would hear things from people. We don't want people in paparazzi in front of the building. We don't want somebody living in the building that's going to be making parties for rock stars or actors. So they were very reluctant to allow public people. Barbra Streisand could not buy an apartment in New York.
Really?
That's why she moved to California in those days.
Because they thought she was going to have wild parties, Barbra Streisand.
Which usually is not the case, especially with me. But so basically now, condos, there's no condo board. You know, you can go, you know, a lot of my clients live in the most exclusive condos in New York.
And that's something your law firm handles for them?
No, we don't do anything outside of media. We recommend them to.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I'm not
So
interested
you're not like
in
a
doing
full
house
service?
closings.
Okay.
No.
Well, I didn't know. Honestly, Alan, there's some clients who they want a full service kind of
So
situation.
they know that we take care of them.
Their music.
In their
media.
Whether it's television, movies, sports, but we don't do house closings. We don't, when they get divorced, we don't do their divorce. We don't do their estate planning or anything like that.
I got you. So when people talk about you, Alan, and you're, you know, behind your back, what do you want them to say about you?
That's it. A mensch.
Is that the word you think Bono would use?
Yeah, I don't know if I think he used it. A guy who tries to do the best he can, tries to not take advantage of people, and at the end of the day, is somebody that people respect and like. That's it.
And considering
I'm
that
still
is your,
working on that.
Considering that is your personality, your temperament, did you ever come across a client that you passed on them?
Yes. Won't give you who, but there have been a few over the years. I said, life is too short.
And you could just tell they're going to be too much.
I said, I'm
of
not for you. This firm is not for you.
And is there problems after that? Any
Well,
ripple
yeah,
effects?
sometimes they were upset. What do you mean? What do you mean? But I said, you don't want me to represent you if I don't feel comfortable. That's not in your interest. So they, they accept it,
Before I let you go, are there any questions you want to ask me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
How are you building such a brilliant practice at your age? You're reminding me of me.
Well, you've said that to me a couple of times, and I take that as a tremendous honor. And you are someone who many of us look to because you're a tremendous success story. You did not grow up with a silver spoon in your mouth. Nothing was handed to you. You worked the hard way. And I believe with your mensch mentality, coupled with instinctive billing, which I love that. That's my favorite part of this afternoon. You always try to do the right thing. And I think if you try to do the right thing and ultimately you do the right thing,
it all works out.
It all works out.
Right.
Well, Alan
thank
Grubman,
you for asking me here.
No,
I really
this is
appreciate it. We had a good time.
I don't know any lawyers in the Hall of Fame, in any Hall of Fame besides you. So
Well, thank you very much.
congratulations. It's a great
Thank you.
honor. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Alan, you are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Holy shit.